During a closed gathering of the Church's highest leaders, a short document began circulating quietly among the cardinals. It was only 2 pages long, written without flourish, and presented as a clarification rather than a confrontation. Its author, Cardinal Arthur Roche, had a clear aim: to restate and defend the restrictions placed on the traditional Roman Rite, often called the traditional Latin Massachusetts. The document carried an air of finality. It suggested that the matter had already been thought through, resolved, and grounded securely in language, history, and theology. It did not argue loudly. It simply assumed authority and expected assent. What followed was not the kind of response many might have anticipated. There was no public protest, no angry counter-statement from the margins of the Church. Instead, a careful and methodical reply came from Joseph Shaw, president of the Una Voce Association and a scholar known for restraint rather than provocation. Shaw did not accuse anyone of bad faith. He did not speculate about hidden agendas. He did something far more destabilizing. He read the document closely and asked whether it actually said what it claimed to say, and whether its claims could withstand careful scrutiny. His response unfolded slowly and deliberately. Rather than beginning with theology or ecclesial politics, Shaw started with something more basic and, in a sense, more dangerous: the words themselves. The document had been issued in both Italian and English, and Shaw quickly noticed that the English version was not merely awkward but incorrect in places. One mistranslation stood out. The Italian word sintonia, which means harmony or being in tune, appeared in English as "siony," a rare and ill-fitting term that failed to convey the original meaning. This was not a trivial error. Shaw observed, almost in passing, that it was surprising an English-speaking cardinal had not noticed such a mistake. The implication was obvious and unsettling. Perhaps the text had not been written, or at least not carefully reviewed, by the person whose authority it carried. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. This mattered because the document claimed to bring clarity. Yet clarity cannot rest on distorted language. If meaning slips at the level of translation, confidence in everything that follows begins to erode. A flawed translation does more than confuse, it undermines credibility. Once that weakness becomes visible, the reader is almost forced to examine the rest of the argument more carefully. That is exactly what Shaw did. He identified 3 main claims supporting the document's position. First, that Catholic liturgy has always changed through what is called organic reform. Second, that the Second Vatican Council explicitly called for liturgical reform. Third, that liturgical unity is necessary to protect the unity of the Church. On the surface, these claims sound reasonable. They are familiar, often repeated, and generally accepted in broad outline. But Shaw's point was not that they were entirely false. It was that they were oversimplified and, in some cases, used in ways that distorted history. The question of unity drew most of his attention. The document argued that unity in worship was essential to unity in faith and suggested that diversity of liturgical forms posed a threat. Shaw responded with history rather than theory. For centuries, the Church has lived with multiple rites without losing unity. This is not a speculative claim. The Ambrosian rite in Milan, the Carthusian rite in monastic communities, and the Mozarabic rite in Spain all existed long before the modern era and remain in full communion with Rome. After the Second Vatican Council, these rites were not abolished but reformed. In more recent times, the Church has approved entirely new liturgical expressions, including the ordinariate used for former Anglicans, the Congolese rite shaped by African culture, and even a locally approved liturgical use for an indigenous community in Mexico. None of these forms have been treated as threats to unity. They are often celebrated as examples of legitimate diversity within the Church. Shaw's question, then, was unavoidable. Why is the traditional Roman rite treated differently? The document did not explain. It asserted danger without demonstrating it. It spoke of unity but did not show why this particular form of worship endangered it. In the absence of explanation, history itself began to challenge the narrative. The document repeatedly appealed to the authority of the Second Vatican Council, presenting it as the decisive source behind post-conciliar reforms. Shaw did not deny the Council's authority or its call for reform. But he argued that this appeal was selective. Vatican II spoke clearly about reform, but it also spoke clearly about legitimate diversity. It encouraged Eastern Catholic churches to preserve and recover their ancient traditions and rejected the idea that uniformity was a value in itself. According to Shaw, this principle was not confined to the East. The Council did not demand a single liturgical form for all Catholics, nor did it envision the suppression of inherited rites simply because they were old. To present Vatican II as mandating universal sameness was to project onto the Council intentions that its texts do not support. This pattern of selective reading became even clearer when Shaw examined the document's use of Pope Paul VI. A phrase commonly translated as "one and the same prayer" was cited as evidence that diverse liturgical forms undermined unity. Shaw pointed out that the original Latin, una idem precatio, simply means a single prayer. Context was everything. Paul VI was responding to fears that moving away from Latin would fracture the Church. His reassurance was that even in different languages, the Mass remains one prayer, one act of worship. To use that reassurance as an argument for suppressing particular liturgical forms was to reverse its meaning. Words mattered here, and meaning had been turned inside out. By this stage, it was clear that Shaw was not merely disputing conclusions. He was questioning how arguments were constructed. He was asking how history was being told, how authority was being invoked, and how texts were being handled. Perhaps most troubling was what the document did not address. Beneath the language of unity and reform lay a deeper, unresolved question. Were the serious criticisms of the post-conciliar liturgical reforms being answered at all, or were they simply being bypassed? The document justified restrictions by appealing to the idea of organic reform, a phrase that sounds reassuring. It suggests natural growth, continuity, development without rupture. Shaw did not deny that the liturgy has changed over time. That would be absurd. But he insisted that not all change is the same. Historically, liturgical reform followed a recognizable pattern. Existing texts were evaluated and adjusted. Some prayers were emphasized, others clarified or reordered. What did not happen was the wholesale replacement of the liturgical framework. Bishops and popes worked within what they had received. They did not discard the missal and begin again from scratch. When the document appealed to historical precedents such as the reforms surrounding the Council of Trent, Shaw argued that these comparisons did not hold. Trent did not create a new Massachusetts. It standardized what already existed, selecting among variants and correcting abuses. It did not invent new Eucharistic prayers or dismantle the inherited structure of the Roman Rite. Earlier reforms brought change, but they did so within continuity. The post-conciliar reform, Shaw argued, was different in kind. Entire prayer texts were newly composed. Ancient prayers were removed or marginalized. The liturgical calendar was radically reshaped. The offertory was replaced. Multiple Eucharistic prayers were introduced, most without ancient precedent. This was not organic development but reconstruction. There was no historical precedent for a reform of this scale. Shaw emphasized that this was not a judgment about intentions. It was a factual observation. If this was true, then invoking organic reform as justification became deeply problematic, because organic growth does not resemble demolition followed by rebuilding. Once again, Shaw returned to Vatican II, not to challenge its authority but to question how it was being used. Many of the changes introduced after the Council were never requested by the Council Fathers. In some cases, the Council explicitly warned against excessive innovation. Latin was to be retained. Gregorian chant was to hold pride of place. Continuity was to be preserved. The reality that followed often diverged sharply from these directives. To attribute later decisions to the Council itself was to use its name as a shield rather than a guide. A pattern became hard to ignore. Language was mistranslated. History was simplified. Authority was selectively invoked. Shaw suggested that what was being presented was not a careful argument but a constructed narrative designed to smooth over difficulties and avoid direct engagement with objections. It relied on the assumption that few readers would examine the sources closely. This mattered far beyond academic debate. When decisions affecting the worship of millions are justified by historical claims, those claims must be solid. Otherwise, authority risks becoming detached from truth. Shaw went further, suggesting that the document relied on an unspoken assumption that many of its intended readers lacked detailed knowledge of liturgical history. If that was the case, the document was not answering objections but bypassing them, offering a simplified story that sounded plausible because few would challenge it. Instead of closing the debate, the document reopened it. Instead of clarifying, it exposed unresolved tensions about authority and tradition, continuity and rupture, obedience and truth. Shaw's conclusion was restrained but clear. The arguments offered did not answer the most serious criticisms of the liturgical reforms or the suppression of the traditional Massachusetts. They sidestepped them. At this point, the issue moved beyond scholarship. These arguments informed real decisions affecting parishes, priests, and ordinary Catholics whose spiritual lives were shaped by the ancient Roman rite. If those decisions rested on shaky historical foundations, the consequences were not merely academic. They were pastoral and deeply human. The conflict revealed a deeper divide, not just about liturgy but about how the Church understands herself. On one side stood an approach that emphasized authority, streamlined history, and narrowly defined unity. On the other stood an approach that examined texts carefully, tested historical claims, and weighed tradition patiently. The tension was no longer technical. It was about identity. Shaw was careful to clarify that he was not rejecting authority or calling for disobedience. In the Catholic understanding, authority is meant to serve truth and safeguard what has been handed down. His insistence was that authority must be intelligible. When it appeals to history, that history must be recognizable. When it invokes unity, that unity must align with lived reality. Otherwise, authority risks losing its moral weight, not through open rebellion but through quiet incomprehension. One of the most troubling aspects of the situation was the cost of simplification. Simplified narratives are effective. They reassure and close questions. But they cannot carry the full weight of lived faith. When believers sense that something essential has been omitted, trust erodes slowly and painfully. For many Catholics, the debate over the traditional Mass is deeply personal. It is about where they encounter God, where silence teaches, where reverence shapes the soul. These are not abstract concerns. They are spiritual homes. Shaw did not deny the need for reform or claim that the past was perfect. His insistence was that reform must respect inheritance rather than erase it. Unity, in his view, is communion rather than uniformity. The Church has endured across cultures and centuries precisely because unity was rooted in shared faith, not identical form. To suppress one expression of that unity while celebrating others requires a stronger explanation than the one offered. In the end, the document intended to settle the matter became a turning point. Not because of scandal or outrage, but because it revealed a gap between official narrative and historical complexity. How the Church tells her story shapes how the faithful understand obedience, tradition, and hope. Beneath every technical dispute lay a deeper spiritual question: what happens when authority appears detached from historical coherence? Shaw offered no manifesto and no slogans. He left behind a question that refuses to disappear. Can the Church speak about her own history in a way that is both authoritative and truthful, without reducing complexity to convenience? The answer to that question will shape not only the future of the traditional Mass, but the credibility of the Church's voice in a world that listens closely for coherence. If this message touched your heart, like this video and share your thoughts in the comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.